Hey guys, DIY Maniac here, your buddy John. In today's video, we're going to be doing a front brake job on a 2013 Honda Civic. So this brake job is pretty much applicable, probably to most Honda Civics, all generations, but at least 8th generation and 9th generation for sure. So I'm going to go about showing you how to go about jacking up the car, removing the wheels, precautions to take when doing a brake change, what things to look for that are application specific to the Civic. And we'll go about that. So let's first, before we start, talk about jacking points and where we need to jack the car up. So we have different options. We could jack each corner up individually, get a jack stand underneath. Always use jack stands, guys. Don't rely just on your jack. Even if you're not going to be under the car at all, you don't want your car to fall on the ground and damage. Put a jack stand underneath. So we can either jack up each individual corner, put a jack stand, but luckily on the Honda Civic, there is a jacking point underneath the car. It is made for jacking. And if you look at the splash shield, it has arrows pointing to it. So I'm going to go under the car with a flashlight so you guys can really see where it is. And that will allow us to jack up the whole front end of the car in one push of the jack. And then we could put jack stands under the corners. So let me show you that right now. Okay guys, so this is the front of the car, right? As we come right in the middle of underneath the car, you're going to look underneath. You see the plastic here? That's your splash shield. You go a little bit further down underneath. I'm going to try to put the light on it the best I can for you. We're going to show you where that jacking point is. And it is right here. There's a, let me see if I can get it for you. There's a big piece of metal right here. And if we look on the splash shield, sorry about the jittering camera. I'm going to try to get the lights for you here. If you look at the splash shield, you see that arrow? So right in the middle of the screen right now, there's an arrow on the plastic pointing to that piece of metal, which is right here. And that is a jack point. So we could put our jack right on that, center it on it, start jacking up, and the whole front end of the car will come up. So that's something good for you guys to know, so you could get the whole front end up and work on both wheels without having to jack up each individual corner. So let's save energy and do it that way. Okay guys, so we have the jack stand under the car and we have it in position, but we haven't started lifting yet. What we want to do first is loosen the lug nuts. So we're going to take, in my particular application, my lug nuts, and it should be stock for all Civics, is 19 millimeter. And we're going to loosen the lug nuts. It's just a bit of safety. We don't want to loosen it when the car is up in the air. The extra force we're putting could cause the car to fall off the jack or the jack stands. Very unlikely. I don't think that would ever happen. You'd have to really shake it. But, you know, let's just play it safe. So we're going to take our 19 millimeter socket. You could either use your impact gun or you could use a large breaker bar. I'm not pulling out my impact gun for a brake job. I don't mind using my breaker bar to break them free. And then I take my impact drill with my socket and zip them off quickly. So when we're loosening the lug nuts, we're not taking them off. Remember, the car's still kind of on the ground. We have it lightly supported by the jack, but we just want to loosen them up so we're not fighting with it when it's in the air. Like any time you remove or put on lug nuts, you want to do it in a star pattern. We don't want to cause any, could possibly cause warpage of the rim. If we start loosening, say, all the top ones and only the bottom ones are holding, it could cause it to bend. Once again, unlikely, especially when loosening, but this is the way, we like to do it. So we do it in a star pattern. So we could start top. When we have 5 lug nuts, this is how you would do it. Top left, bottom right, top right, bottom left, and then the bottom one. So as long as you're doing it in a pattern that's opposing from each other, right? So you could do it this way, bam, 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 right? Just the way we do it. So I'm going to go ahead and loosen both sides. Going to be working on both sides at the same time. And then we'll pick up the video and I'll show you what the next steps are. So we have the car jacked up. Both wheels are off the ground. Like we said, safety first. So we're going to want to slide our jack stand underneath. So you're going to put that under the car. And you're going to see on both the front corners and the back, there's we call it a pinch weld. There's a little ridge that runs down underneath the car. And on the corners, it's a reinforced section. So you're going to see it's a bit of a thicker piece of metal. So we're going to place our jack stand under there, and then we're going to lower our jack so all the weight of the car is on the jack stand. Now to remove the wheel, we've already went ahead and loosened it with the breaker bar. I like to use my impact gun with my socket on it. So you get yourself a socket adapter for 1/2 inch or 3/8 or quarter, whichever one you're using. And you put your 19mm socket and you zip off your lug nuts. I find this is the quickest way. I don't have to break out my pneumatic impact gun. Noisy, it's a hassle. For a job like this, not needed. Now, these are winter tires. So here in Quebec, Canada, we have to use winter tires. These are my winter tires. And because it's winter, there's corrosion. So the tires sometimes don't want to come off easily. And that could also obviously translate to the brake components as well, but we'll get to that part when it comes. So if we need to remove the tire, sometimes, you know, it won't just come off. You got to give it a good kick. So what I like to do is get in behind it, take my foot on the sidewall of the tire, and just give it a good smack. And it comes right off. Not as graceful maybe as I was hoping for the video, but she's off. And we can roll our tire out of the way. And now we'll take a look at the brakes themselves. So here's the brakes we're going to be changing. Here's the disc. So these brakes are 3 years old, and I would say I got about, I'd say probably 80,000 kilometers on these brakes. Maybe not 80,000, maybe 70,000. So could they live a little bit longer? I think I probably still have another summer in them. But you know what? I'd rather do it now. I'm in here doing maintenance anyways. Let's change the brakes now. And I order all my brake parts from Rock Auto. And even with shipping, you could get good quality parts at much cheaper than you would at your local auto parts store. So this is the brake components we're going to be removing. So I'm going to go ahead now, pause the video, put you guys a bit on a tripod so we could see better. I'm going to show you what socket sizes, what precautions you need to take, and what is involved in removing these brake components. So I'll get right back with you. So the first bolts we're going to have to remove are the caliper to caliper bracket bolts. So these are these little bolts back here that screw into the caliper slide pins. These are 12mm. They're not torqued on very much. I think it's around 20 to 25 foot-pounds. Don't worry guys, all torque specs I'll be giving you when I'm reassembling. So you'll have all those torque specs. So 12mm, we have one on the top and we have one on the bottom as well. You can see it right there. Camera doesn't want to focus, but it's right there. So we're going to have to remove both of those, and that's going to allow us to swing the caliper up off the brake pads and the caliper bracket. So this is a caliper bracket. That's our caliper. Brake pads are in there. So once we undo those bolts, this caliper is going to swing right up. Now, if we were just doing brake pads and not taking off the rotors, we could actually just swing the undo the bottom one, loosen the top one, swing the caliper out of the way, change out our brake pads. But because we got to remove the rotor, we have to remove the caliper. We have to remove the caliper bracket to allow us to slide the rotor off. Okay. So we're going to go ahead and remove those two. So we're going to take, I always like using a 3/8 drive ratchet with the 12mm socket. But on the Honda Civic, you do have a lot of room back here. So you can use a 1/2 inch, 1/4 inch might be a little small, but they aren't torqued on very much. So you shouldn't have too much problem with them. So you just give it a little knock and she will loosen like that. She's loose. Now, before you remove completely the top one, let's loosen the bottom one. Because if we remove the top and we try to loosen the bottom, the caliper is going to pull away and it's going to make our life difficult. So don't remove it, just loosen it, get it loose, keep it in there, remove the bottom one. So let me go ahead and remove those two bolts, and then I'm going to show you what you need to do. What I suggest you guys get, if you don't have, is the magnetic tray. So you can put all your screws and fasteners in there so you don't misplace them. Trust me, as you can see, if I was doing a brake job in my wife's car yesterday, things get dirty, a screw or bolt falls, it's easy to misplace, rolls away. Just get yourself a magnetic tray. I love mine, comes in very handy. So I'll be right back with you guys. Okay, so those two bolts are out, and now we're going to be able to slide the caliper off. Yes, guys, I'm wearing gloves. There's a YouTube channel I like to watch. He's a plumber. Steve, I hope I'm pronouncing his last name right, Laramere, I believe it's how it's called. I think he's out of Boston. Funny plumber. Love watching him, and he always wears gloves, and he always says, "Why do I wear gloves?" when he's changing a toilet and you see all that grime. That's why he wears gloves, and that's why I wear gloves, guys. I'm tired of years of mechanics getting my hands all dirty and greasy. It's not my full-time job. Don't want to go to work with greasy fingernails, so I wear my gloves. So we're going to take this caliper and slide it up, pull it off of the brake pads and the caliper bracket, and get yourself a bungee cord to hang the caliper. Because once it's off, the only thing supporting it is the brake line. You don't want to leave it hanging from the brake line. That's not a good idea. So I like to take a bungee cord, get it up on the spring, on the suspension spring, as high as you can. And then when we pull the caliper off, we could hang it from there. So to get the caliper off, hopefully I can do this one-handed. And it's not going to let me, I bet you. Oh, there we go. Okay. Sorry, I don't know if you missed that. You pull it away. You see she comes off, right? And you're going to pull her off the brake pads. It's free, okay? And what I like to do now is take my bungee cord and bring it in through here, or even through the hole where the caliper, where that bolt you took out is, and that'll hang it nicely, so it's not putting any tension on the brake line itself. So let me go ahead and do that. It's hard to do stuff one-handed, and my tripod's horrible. So I'm gonna go hang that caliper, and I'll show you what the next steps are. So you can see the caliper's hanging for the bungee cord. There's no tension at all on that brake line. And that's the way you want to do it. So what we're going to do now that our caliper is off, we're going to remove the brake pads. Before we do that, we have these two springs. Now in Hondas, it uses these little wire springs that go from one brake pad to the other. They basically, in case you don't understand how the braking system works, it's a floating caliper. Caliper floats, brake pads kind of just float. Once you let go of the brake pedal and the wheel starts turning, they release. And the velocity of the rotor turning spreads them kind of apart. Well, these little springs help that even more to make sure the pads are not putting too much force on the rotor when you're not braking, as to not wear out the brake pads prematurely. So your new brake pads should definitely come with this. All the brake pads I've ever bought have. Maybe hold on to them just in case maybe the economy ones, the really economy brake pads don't come with it. It's good that you have it. Now, while I'm on this, we talked about economy brake pads. Now, I'm not one to judge. I know everyone's in different financial situations. But guys, this is the one thing that's stopping you. This is probably one of the most important components on your car. I don't know if you want to go too cheap on it. I'm not saying the economy ones are garbage, but they're $20 or $15 for a set of brake pads for a reason. Once again, just my opinion. I'm not saying go out and buy, the most expensive high-performance brake pads, but get yourself a good set of brake pads and a good set of rotors, a good quality by a reputable manufacturer. Just my opinion. I like Raybestos, and I'll show you which ones I go with. And you guys make that decision yourself. But once again, I have my kids in the car, my wife in the car. I want to be safe. But just my opinion. I'm sorry if that offends anyone. So with those wires off, we can now remove the old brake pads. And these come right off. And we could put those aside. That's the front brake pad. Rear brake pad comes off. And now all it's leaving us now is the caliper bracket. So that's this big piece here. And it's going to be the same thing. We're going to have two fasteners on the back. So I'm going to stop the video. I'm going to bring the camera in behind so you guys could see what those bolts are. Okay guys, I'm going to try to show you. I'm going to do my best to get my phone in behind there. I don't even know if it's going to see it. I don't even know what you guys are looking at because I can't see my phone, but hopefully you could see it. They are 17 millimeter bolts. There's one on top and one on the bottom right here. So we got to remove those two. Now, those two bolts are torqued on. Once again, torque specs will be given on reassembly. I want to say at around 60 foot-pounds. They're on there pretty snug. So I like to use a 1/2-inch ratchet. So give me a little more length on it. You could use a 3/8 if you have a longer 3/8 ratchet, like an 8-inch or 12-inch, to give you a little more leverage to really get those off. So I'm going to go in there now, remove those, and then I'll show you what the next steps are. Okay guys, so I removed the caliper bracket from the steering knuckle by removing those two 17 millimeter bolts. And here you can see the bracket. So I'm going to show you, and later in the video, I'm going to go about how to disassemble it, service it, clean it, lube it up, but just basically so you can see what it looks like. You have your slide pins over here with your rubber boots. So those we're going to be removing, and I'll show you what needs to be done to those. We also have our stainless steel shims that where the brake pads make contact on the bracket. Stainless steel shim is there for a reason. If you had the brake pad ear, which is steel, on steel, which is the caliper bracket, corrosion would cause it to seize up. So you have like a stainless steel shim that's in there. We put a little bit of lube as well. And that stops any, it won't allow for any corrosion and will allow the brake pad to always move back and forth. As you brake, move it in to brake. As you release, move it away. It allows it to slide easy. So that's why you have those shims. Once again, a good quality brake pad will come with the shims. If not, definitely keep these. Usually they're not in bad shape. I mean, if you clean them up, you could definitely reuse them. But anyways, I'll go about later in the video on how to go about cleaning this, taking it apart, putting on the new components. So I'll put that aside for now. So once we have the bracket off and the calipers off, the only thing that's stopping us, that's left in our way now, is removing the rotor. There's nothing else holding the rotor on except, now I've changed these brakes before, so I don't have any retaining screws. From the factory, there are 2 Phillips head, so Phillips head is star head, screws that basically go through the brake rotor into the hub, the back of the hub. Now, why are those there? Pretty much for assembly. When they're assembling the car, so they don't fall off as it's going down the assembly line, they put those little Phillips screws. Can you put them back in when you do a brake job? Of course, there's nothing stopping you, but they're not needed. It's the wheel that holds the brake rotor on. You don't really need those little screws. A lot of people do like to put them on, back in. Power to you, go right ahead. There's nothing wrong with that. Definitely put anti-seize on them when you're going to put them back in. But most of the time when you're trying to get those little suckers out, they're a pain in the butt. They don't want to come out. And usually you end up stripping them out. You got to drill them out, just a pain in the butt. So once I get them out the first time, I leave them out. And actually what I do sometimes is that when I buy a brand new car, on the first tire rotation, I take them out, even though I'm not doing a brake job, just so I don't have to worry down the line in a couple of years when the first brake job is needed, that those things are corroded in there. If you prefer to keep them and like having them, here's my suggestion. Do the same thing when you buy a new car. Take them out, put anti-seize on them, and put them back in. So at least you know for sure next time you take them out or you need to do a brake job, you won't be swearing up and down. What else do we have in the rotor? We have 2 holes. These are threaded holes. I can't remember the size. I want to say they're 10 millimeter. I might be wrong. Let me know in the comments if it's 10 or 12. Basically what they're there for is you could thread a bolt in there that will then push against the hub to basically press or pull the rotor off. Like I said, here in Quebec, Canada, and any places in the salt belt, in the winter, these things get heavily corroded on and they're a pain in the butt to get off. I've never had to use these holes to get them off. Because I'm replacing the rotors, I don't really care if I damage them too much. I don't mind giving them a good whack with a hammer on the mating surface to pop them off. And that usually takes it right off. What I like to do before smacking it with a hammer to vibrate it, to loosen it up, put your lug nuts on. Because if you miss with that hammer and you hit this stud on the threads, you can mar the threads and you'll never get your lug nut back on. So just give it a few turns with the lug nut. So if you were to miss with the hammer, you won't damage your stud. Where you're going to want to hit is right here in between the studs to cause a vibration, to loosen it up. That surface rust that's in there, that's going to loosen it. If it's getting really hard, there's nothing wrong because we're changing it. Remember, not if you're keeping this rotor, don't hit the braking surface, but because we're changing it, give it a good whack. Some people will tell you it's not good technique to hit this because you could damage the wheel bearing. I've done 100 brake jobs, never damaged the wheel bearing doing it. It's not like I go crazy with a jackhammer on it. But, you know, to each his own. If you're worried that you might damage or hurt your wheel bearing or any other suspension component, then go ahead and use those threaded holes, put your bolt in it to press it off. So I'm going to put the camera down and I'm going to show you guys how I get it off with a hammer. Hold on, this is going to be fun. Sorry guys, I thought I pressed record and I didn't, so you missed me hitting the brake rotor with a hammer. Probably nothing entertaining anyway, so you didn't miss much. So the brake rotor is off. You can see the hub and the wheel studs and the dust shield in behind. And here's our rotor. And I'm not going to lie, this one was a pain getting off. Not the worst one I've had, but it was a pain. And the reason that was is because if you look on the inside, you can see there's all that rust, right? So if we look at the hub, which is right here, this fits almost perfectly inside that top hat of the brake rotor. So as this rusts and becomes smaller because of rust, right? It makes like a lip of rust. So when you're trying to pull the rotor off, it's kind of like fingers on here, grabbing it, won't come off. So I did my technique, like I said, you hit it with a hammer in between the studs, put your lug nuts, not to damage your stud, to vibrate it to shock it loose. It came loose, but I wasn't able to pull it off because of that ridge of rust, holding it on like fingers basically. So what I had to do is keep knocking. And then what I did is, because we have this big empty space here, from in behind, I would give it a couple of taps, turn it a quarter turn, give it a couple of taps, and basically slowly press it off from behind. So in this example, those two threaded bolts through the top hat of the rotor, pushing against here, basically pulling your rotor off, would have been a good solution. But it worked well for me. Just tap, tap, turn, tap, tap, eventually slowly working it off until it broke free of all the rust and it fell off. So what you want to do now, over here, there's not much prep to do here, but what I like to do, sorry if I'm shaking the camera, what I like to do is clean the hub. So take a wire brush and get a lot of this rust off. There's not much, but still get it off. Go around here from the lip of the hub, clean it up. You could even use a pneumatic die grinder with a wire brush, which is what I'm going to use, or just a hand wire brush, and clean up this surface here and even the mating surface. Now here's where a big point of some people like to do is put anti-seize here on the mating surface. Don't put anti-seize there. Remember, this brake rotor has to sit flush. I know anti-seize doesn't seem like much, like it would be thick and cause the rotor to sit crooked, but it could, believe it or not, if you're putting way too much. You don't need anti-seize here. There's no rust formation or any kind of rust formation that's going to cause the rotor not to come off. It's all caused by the rotor itself. You can put all the anti-seize you want, it's still going to happen. So don't even bother putting anti-seize. Okay guys, so I cleaned up the hub and the mating surface where the rotor goes. And now we could concentrate on the caliper bracket and the components that are on it. So here's our caliper bracket. So the first thing we could do is remove these shims, these stainless steel shims. Like I said, if your new brake pads don't come with these, keep the old ones and clean them up. But every brake pad I've ever bought comes with them. I can't speak for the super cheap brake pads. Maybe they don't. So keep them aside just in case you do need them. So we're going to remove, there's a shim on the top and the bottom of the caliper bracket. So you're going to remove those. And what I like to do next is clean up these surfaces. So where the shim sits on. There is always a little bit of corrosion there, a little bit of grime, which could cause the shim to sit higher than what it's supposed to. If the shim sits higher than what it's supposed to and the brake pad sits in there, and it's already a tight tolerance for brake pads to cut down on noise, it could cause the brake pad to bind. You might have trouble getting it in when you try to slide it into the bracket, or when you're braking, it might cause it not to move as freely as it's supposed to. So I like to clean up these surfaces. Just a wire brush, you go in there, give it a good cleaning. Now, I do a brake service once a year. Well, technically I do a brake service twice a year. Every time I rotate my tires or change over my summer to winter tires, I re-lube all the brakes. I don't dismantle everything twice a year because that might be a little too much. But what I do once a year in the spring, if I'm not doing a brake job, I remove all this stuff. I remove the bracket, I remove the shim, keep it aside because I will be reusing the shim in that scenario. And I clean up all the surfaces, just get everything nice and clean. Like I said, here in our climate with all the grime and crud in the winter driving, it could cause issues when, building up on the brakes. As you see, a lot of people having seizing brakes, they have to go to the garage. Their brake pads might still have a lot of meat on it, but they need to be changed because their brakes seized up and it caused the rotor to be damaged, the brake pad to prematurely fail, say on the inner pad might wear out a lot more than the outer pad. So by doing a little bit of brake maintenance once a year, well, twice a year, but a big maintenance once a year, it'll save you that hassle. So just with the wire brush, cleaning up that surface, and you can see now that it's nice and clean. And once we do that, the next step is our guide pins or sliders. So you can see there's a rubber boot over here. So we pull back the rubber boot, and that frees up that guide pin or slider. allows us to pull it out. So there's the bottom one. It's bottom, right? Yeah, it's the bottom one. And now we're going to do the top one. We're going to slide it out. Now the top one's going to be a little bit harder to pull out. And I'll show you why. Because on the top one, you have a little rubber bushing, I guess you could call it, on the end of the pin. And that's to cut down on noise. Because it's a floating caliper, basically it acts as a buffer. So the caliper is not shaking inside the bracket and could make noise when you're braking or even when you're just driving, going over bumps. Does it really break down the noise that much? I don't know. But that's why it's there. The problem is with this rubber, it doesn't like caliper grease, brake grease. It swells. And as you put brake grease on, this bushing swells and could actually cause the pin not to move freely inside. So something to keep in mind, these are changeable. So you could buy a kit. I don't think you could buy just the bushing, but it comes with the boots as well. I think it's like $10. I think probably for both calipers that you could redo it. I just redid it last year, so I'm not going to do it again. But it comes with new boots, new bushings. The guide pins are pretty much good for life, unless they get damaged for whatever reason. Normally you don't have to change them, so you don't have to worry about that. So we're going to take out our guide pins, and we're going to use some brake cleaner with a rag. We're going to clean up that surface, get all the old brake grease off. Another thing I like to do is spray brake cleaner into the bores of the brake caliper bracket where those pins slide in to remove any old brake grease, any grime that's in there, get it nice and clean. What I like to do is take a drill bit that's just a little bit smaller than the hole that it's going into, wrap a shop towel around it, get it in there and ream it basically. You don't even have to use a drill bit. You could use anything that's round that will go in there, that will put some tension against the shop towel, so as you turn it, it'll scrub the inner walls of that bore. And that'll give us a nice clean surface in there. So when we put our new grease, it's only new grease. It's not getting mixed with anything old. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. So I'm not going to show that on video, but it's pretty much just spray brake cleaner in there, shop towel with anything round to ream it out. Same thing with your pins, shop towel with some brake cleaner, clean them off. And then I'm going to show you how we go about re-lubing and what lube to use and why it's important to use the proper brake lube. Okay guys, so I've gone ahead and did as I said. I cleaned up the slide pins with brake cleaner, got all the old grease off. So both of those are clean. I as well cleaned out the bores of the brake caliper, get all the brake caliper bracket, get all that old grime out. So now we're ready to lube up those pins to put them back in. Very important you use the right grease. You can't just use any regular grease like wheel bearing grease or general purpose grease. It doesn't have the heat capacity that's required for brake components. You need a high heat brake grease that won't liquefy basically under extreme heat. These brakes get really hot. You put like a wheel bearing grease or a all-purpose grease, it's just going to turn to liquid. So you got to get yourself a brake caliper grease. I use a synthetic one. I use the Permatex, been using it for a long time. Comes in a little tube. I wish it came in bigger. I used to get it in a big like a tin. I can't find it anymore. If you guys know where I could get it in bigger volume, please let me know. So I use that. So what I like to do is I take my guide pin, take out a little bit of grease. You don't need much. You know, some people like to really over grease these things. Just put a little dab on your pin, then use your finger and spread it out evenly over the whole pin. Get all the surfaces. And then what you're going to do, so we said the bushing's on top. Now, does it matter if that bushing's on top or the bottom? That's a good question. Don't think it does. Let me know in the comments if it does matter or what your opinion is. I always just put it on the top because that's where it always is when I do a first brake change on a car. So I'm just going with that theory, I guess, so to speak. So we know on this car, this is the top. So we're going to take our pin and we're going to slide it in. As I slide it in, I like to turn it a bit too, just to get that grease all over. And we slide it in and we push it all the way down. So you can see the tight seal that's in there. See, when I push it down, it wants to come right back out because the grease is basically forcing it out, not allowing the air to push through. So push it down and it's going to cause the rubber boot to reseat. There's like a little lip on the pin. See, if you look on the pin, there's like a little lip that the boot sits into. So you can see there we go. We got it all nice and in. And now we're going to do the same thing for our bottom pin. we're going to lube it up, and we're going to stick it in. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, and then I'll show you what the next step is. Okay guys, so we're going to now take our new shims that came with our brake pads, and we're going to put them in place. So there's no top or bottom, you're universal. So you're going to seat it on as such, and you're going to basically push down. So you're going to press it into place as such. You kind of hear it, this clips in. And you're going to seat it in like that, and you're in. And now you're going to take your other one, and you're going to do the same thing on the top or bottom, depending which way you're looking at it. And you're going to push it down, and you hear it click in place, and you're in. Now what you could do is you could take a little bit of your brake grease, and you could lightly lubricate the surface of the shim inside the recess part, on the side walls, the little raised part. This is where the brake pad ears make contacts. You want to have a little bit of lube there. You either put the lube here, or you can put the lube on the brake pad ear. Same thing will happen. I like to put a little film on the shims themselves to make sure they're well covered. And then I could slide my brake pads in. So I'm going to go ahead now, and we're going to go back to the car, and I'm going to put the new rotor on, and I'm going to show you what brake components that I purchased. So when we look at what brake components I purchased, once again from Rock Auto, I like Raybestos, and not the entry level, but more of the premium level braking brake parts. This is their advanced technology brake rotor. So it has the coated top hat. So any part that's not braking surface is coated with rust prohibitor, and it's almost like a paint. It's nice and black, and it won't rust. It'll always look nice. So I like that technology. It has it on the outside of the hat, the inside of the hat, and even on the leading edge here, so you don't get all that crappy looking rust. And that also helps to make it easier next time you have to take it off. I think these were $50 Canadian a piece plus shipping. If you go to your local parts store, they're probably over 100. I wouldn't be surprised. Brake pads, Raybestos again. I really like the Element 3. I've been using them quite a few times now with great success. They don't wear out prematurely. They're not noisy. I just like everything about them. They come with all the parts you need. They come with multiple shims. They come, like in my case, those little wire spreaders we were seeing when I took the pads off. Comes with those. And I want to say these were about $40 Canadian plus shipping. Worth the investment. They're not expensive. And really, I really like them. I've used them now twice on my car, twice on my wife's car. On my previous cars, always had great success with them. So we're going to be putting the new brake rotor onto the car. Before we do that though, we need to clean it. From the factory, it comes with an oil film on it to prevent any kind of corrosion. So you need to wipe that off. So you take some brake cleaner, spray it, take a shop towel, wipe it off before putting it on the car. So the new rotor is cleaned, both sides, all surfaces with brake cleaner. Get all that oil off, and I've put it into place. So the next step now is basically we're going to reverse what we did taking everything apart. So the first step we're going to do is put the brake caliper bracket back on. So we have those two 17mm bolts that we have to put on. Those are going to be torqued to 80 foot-pounds. Now I suggest you guys do for torque specs, right? I mean, I'm putting it on the video so you guys don't have to research it. But here's what I did. I made myself a template or a paper laminated, it says Civic on it, because I made one for all my different cars with all my torque specs that you could imagine. Look at all those torque specs, right? So most of them I'm never going to need, but I just copy and pasted them from online manuals. I highlighted in yellow the ones I use the most, so brake components, wheel nuts, oil pan, as the such. So it's always on hand, readily accessible. I could look at it right away, and I know what torque spec I need to use. I strongly recommend this. If you guys want, give me a message on YouTube with a private message with your email, and I will email you this template. So for the Civic, it'll be applicable for 9th generation. I can't say if it's applicable for 8th generation or not, but definitely, 2012 to 2015. It's very handy to have. So we're going to go ahead and put that brake caliper back on. So it's basically, reversal of how we took it off. We're going to slide it into place, take our 2 bolts in the back, and we're going to torque it on. Now, while we're on the subject of torque, guys, get yourself a torque wrench. If you're doing any kind of automotive work, get a torque wrench. If you don't want to get a torque wrench, don't do automotive work. I'm sorry. I know some people aren't going to agree with me, but when you're talking components like engine components, brake components, you want it torque to spec. I don't care how many years you've been a mechanic. I've been doing auto mechanics for many years now, not as a profession, but still doing a lot of it. My hand is not calibrated. I can kind of get it close for, stuff that's not essential, but I always use my torque wrench, especially on brake components, oil pan, spark plugs, as such, right, guys? Just make the investment. If you're going to save the money by not going to the garage, reinvest it in your own home garage and get some proper tools. So I'm going to go ahead and put that on. So once again, that's your caliper bracket assembly to your steering knuckle, the two 17mm bolts, torqued to 80 foot-pounds. Okay, guys, so our caliper bracket is on. It's torqued to spec. And now what we're going to do is we're going to be putting our brake pads into the caliper. So when we look at our brake pad, we have obviously 2 brake pads. Well, one is going to have a wear indicator. So there's a little tab. That's your inside pad. It's just the way it is from the factory. It goes on the inside. I guess self-explanatory. And then your other one is your outside pad. Now, what's nice about these pads is they have these nice stainless steel shims on the back, which is very nice. I still like to put a little light layer of that high temp grease on this shim just to cut down any chatter that might be there. There shouldn't be any, but still, a little bit of grease will cut down any little bit of noise you may have, whether that's through brake vibration or just through brake movement. I've always done it. I've never had brake noise. You could try not doing it. See what, let me know what it gives you. So you're going to be putting the way it's done, we're going to take our brake grease. So like I said, I put a little bit of grease already on the inside of the shim, but I also like to put a little bit on the tab as well, the ears of the pad. So we get a little bit of grease out. And we put a little bit of grease there. You can actually use the tube as an applicator. Just lightly grease. You don't need too much grease, because remember, the more grease you put, it's just going to be a magnet for dirt and grime, and you're going to build up more of that sludge that can impede movement. So actually, the grease could hurt you in some sense if you put way too much. I've seen people over grease so much, it doesn't require much. So we put a little bit there, and then like I said, I like to put a little bit just on that back shim. So just a light layer, not much. Yeah, it's going to attract some grime and dirt. It's not the end of the world. So put a little bit there. And then we take our pad and we put it into our shim. So you could start it in the bottom shim and then it slides into the top. See how easy that is? Not hard at all. And it's easy because we made sure to clean the caliper bracket, the surface where the shim sits on. So there's nice free movement. If we didn't clean off all that rust and grime, the shim would be sitting a little bit higher. It'd be hard to get that pad in. So by cleaning it, it gives us a little more freedom, so to speak, and a space to do that. So we're going to do the same thing with our outside pad. We're going to put a little bit of grease on the ears. Not much, just a little bit. I mean, there's thousands of videos on YouTube with people doing brake jobs, right? So I'm not the first person to do it. I'm not doing it maybe the best way. I'm doing it my way. Like I said, I'm not a professional mechanic by trade, but I've done hundreds of brake jobs. I've never had one fail on me or have problems that I know about. Maybe, no, just joking. Never had any comebacks from friends or family. So I'm pretty confident that that I'm doing it. May not be the textbook way, but it works. And she slides right in. Now, the next step we have to do is we take I'm going to use the old one to demonstrate, but I have new ones. These wire spreaders, I guess we could call them. And when we look on the pad itself, we have 2 little holes in the front face of the pad on the top and 2 little holes on the bottom. And the springs have little tabs that fit into those holes. So but one thing to keep in mind, when you put these springs in, the brake pads are going to want to pull apart. So you kind of got to hold them a bit. So it's a two-handed thing. You put those 2 springs in, kind of hold the brake pads in place, then slide your caliper over to hold everything together. I'm going to go get the new ones, not reuse the old ones. So that's pretty much how the pads fit into the caliper bracket, and the steps I like to take to ensure limited brake noise and easy movement of the brake pad within the bracket. So I'm going to go ahead and put those tabs. I'm going to slide my caliper back over, and then we're going to pick up the video and I'll show you, tell you the torque specs for those screws that hold the caliper onto the bracket itself. Now guys, I forgot an important step before I go put the caliper on that I want to talk to you about, and that's the caliper piston, right? So that's your piston right there. It's that little cup. And when you push the brake pedal, hydraulic fluid, brake fluid gets pushed through the line and forces that piston outwards, putting pressure on the pad. Now, as your brakes wear and get older, that piston in its parked position or resting position, when no brakes are applied, is further out because the pads got thinner. Therefore, they're not as wide. So the piston comes further out in its resting position. Now, when you put new brake pads on, they're full width. So if you try to slide that caliper over, it's not going to fit. You need to push this piston back into its bore to full opening to be able to slide them over. So that's a point that's always on big discussion for most people, is how do I do it? I use a C-clamp. You could use a very big pair of channel locks as well. I like to put the C-clamp over top the piston on one end, and then from the bottom over here, not on the line, but on the flat part of the bottom of the caliper, tighten the C-clamp and push the piston back in. You could also use a big channel lock if you have big enough ones to put your hands to force it back in. Now, do you just push the piston back in, or do you open the bleeder screw, the bleeder valve for the brake fluid? That's a big point of discussion for most people. People say that obviously by pushing the piston back in, you're reversing flow. Any corrosion that's in that caliper will be forced back into the system and into the brake line. It could put excess pressure on the brake system. So a lot of people prefer to open up the bleeder screw and relieve pressure as you're pushing the piston back in. Some people don't. They just keep the bleeder screw closed and they push the piston back in. Now, if you're going to leave the bleeder screw closed, I do strongly suggest you open up the brake fluid cap reservoir. So we'll see where that is on the Honda Civic. It's right there. Because as you push that piston in, fluid's going to be forced back through the system and back into the reservoir, right? Well, you need now to open up that reservoir to alleviate the pressure in the system, allow the air to escape because you're backfilling with fluid, and not to put too much pressure. Can you leave the cap on? I guess you could. Like I said, I don't recommend it. If you're not going to open the bleeder screw, leave the cap off to allow excess pressure to vacate. If you're going to open the bleeder screw, then you don't really need to remove the cap because the excess fluid comes out of the bleeder screw and the pressure is relieved that way. So I'm not going to tell you guys which way I do it because it's such a big point of discussion on message boards, on forums. In my opinion, both are okay. Both are not okay. Depends how you do it. Make sure you're doing it right. If you open the bleeder screw, you should be bleeding the brakes after. Some people say you don't have to because you're backflowing. So as soon as you finish pushing that caliper in, if you close the bleeder screw, no air should have got it in. Anytime that, in my opinion, anytime the system is opened in any way, meaning a line disconnected or a bleeder screw open, you need to bleed because there is a chance air got in, and most likely it did, even if minute. So I'll let you guys decide which way you want to do it, and we'll leave it at that. So I'm going to go ahead and push that piston back in and put the caliper back in place. So the caliper is back in place. So we put our two spreading wires that help spread the pads apart. So you have the one on the top and the one on the bottom. So I put those in and then holding the pads closed, slid the caliper over. One thing to keep in mind when you look at the caliper itself and the slide pins, on the head of the slide pin, there's a flat spot. The flat spot mates up with a flat spot on the ear of the caliper. So why is that there? That's there to stop the slider or the pin from turning when you're trying to tighten the retaining screw that goes into that pin. So just remember that you got to mate those two surfaces up, flat spot to flat spot, both top and bottom. So put your caliper to caliper bracket bolts in, hand tight, and now we're going to torque them. So we're going to turn to our trusty torque sheet, and we're going to look at for our brake components. So we're looking at front brake caliper bolts, 25 foot-pounds. So we're going to go 25 foot-pounds on both the top and the bottom one. So we're going to tighten up those. So the caliper is fastened. We torque those two 12 millimeter caliper to caliper bracket bolts to our 25 foot-pounds. The only thing left now to do is put the wheel back on. Honda specification is 80 foot-pounds for the lug nuts. I think that's a pretty good standard for most cars. I know on some of the older cars with steel wheels, these say always 100. But I notice on a lot of the newer cars, they're saying 80 foot-pounds is all that's needed. So anyways, guys, I mean, that's how to do it. I'm not going to show you the other side. That way I could do it much faster and go have dinner. But I think that gives you a good understanding of how to change the front brakes on the 9th generation Honda Civic, 2012 to 2015, non-SI. And, you know, it's probably applicable to the 8th generation and 7th generation for all I know, but don't take my word on that. So, you know, that just highlighted some of the things to look out for. Definitely leave your comments down below. Let me know if you have any suggestions or things you would have done differently. Also, like I said, hit me up in messaging if you want to get that copy of the PDF of the torque specs for the Honda Civic. I have it available also for a 2012 Santa Fe. If you want that, I can send that to you as well. So I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Once again, thanks a lot for watching. Remember to like and subscribe, as we always say, and have yourselves a great day. Talk to you later.